Now, to the topic of the day. Why are we having this special event? What's going on? Let me kind of walk you guys through it a little bit. So I'm scrolling along these Twitter streets as one does, okay? And I come across a very fresh post of an article by someone who has confessed that they muted me. Julian Adorni. Okay, Julian Adorni is a Manhattan Fellow adjacent person, but he is a writer and a marketing consultant, is what it says on his Mises Institute, Austrian Economics, Freedom, and Peace. Apparently, he is a Mises Institute Fellow, okay? And a writer and a marketing consultant with the Foundation for Economic Education, and has previously written for the National Review, the Federalist, and other outlets. Some of his titles are The New Racism of the Elect, Teaching Critical Race Theory Isn't Education, It's Indoctrination, Opposing Critical Race Theory Doesn't Make You a White Supremacist. You get the idea. Okay, so these are some of the things that he has authored. And recently, he, along with a former professor at Notre Dame and a current professor at, I believe, Occidental University is what it's called, Jacob Mackey. So Professor Jacob Mackey co-wrote this article, and the title jumped out at me. The title is Virtuous Lies and Black Despair. So what jumped out to me right away is two racialized white men writing about black despair, and the implication that the virtuous lie was somehow that black despair existed or that racism exists was the implication. So as soon as I saw that, I just thought, wow, the audacity, the brazenness of being willing to author such a piece. And so I put that statement out on Twitter just to get my feedback, because sometimes, I don't think I'm perfect. I have my biases. So I'm like, maybe I'm off on this. Maybe I'm looking at this wrong. But I got a lot of reinforcement and confirmation from people who saw it. And one of my mutuals who is here with us today, Tori, suggested that we have a discussion about it. And I was like, let's just do a read through. Let's do a live read through and let's do an analysis of it. We were looking for a third person, and my man MKP decided to join in, and he answered the call. So here we are, the three of us here to discuss this article. And I'm just going to give you guys a chance before we get into the read along to introduce yourselves and maybe talk about why you agreed to engage in this. So Tori, you go first, and then MKP.
Hey folks. Okay, I'm Tori Black. I wanted to participate in this because I feel like a lot of times folks write a long form thing, and it's really difficult to address the many points that they made inside of a document. So that they come to a conclusion. It's a whole piece, and it's really difficult to kind of take it apart and discuss all the parts that make it. So I thought it would be really fun to just take this piece and go through it and discuss what we think. There's really nothing special about me. I'm on Twitter. I'm I'm usual with the contraband wagon. And I have a website, Decorum by Tori, decorumxtory.com. If you're interested in chit-chatting with me outside Twitter. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much. And MKP, maybe you could talk about what brings you.
MPK.
Oh, MPK. I'm sorry. I'm part of the Mankind Project, and we say MKP, so I'm so used to it. MPK, please.
So yeah, I'm Machine Pun Kelly, or MPK, Kelly Scaletta. I have just a very personal history with anti-racism going back 25 years with friends that I've had gone through a lot of learning experiences with. And so I was looking at this article, and I found it ironic that it's allegedly about being honest in this discussion. And I just found that a lot of the examples he used and the links he provided were very dishonest. So I just felt like, I'd like to come on and discuss that with you.
Perfect. So I'm glad to have you both here for that. And I think with that, let's just go ahead and jump into the article. Virtuous Lies and Black Despair. Okay, if you go to the link, which I'll provide here, I'll put it in the chat for anybody who wants to follow along. And you'll see that there's an image there that says racism is a pandemic. And let's go from there. So Virtuous Lies and Black Despair. Julian Adorni, Jake Mackey. Teenage depression and suicide rates have been rising in the U.S. for years, but the rates among Black teens are rising farther and faster than among those of other ethnicities. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Youth Risk Behavior Survey from 2011 to 2021, the percentage of Black teens who seriously considered suicide rose 69 percentage points from 13% in 2011 to a frightening 22% in 2021. The average increase among all ethnicities was 37.5 percentage points, just over half the rise documented in Black teens. The same trend can be seen across multiple measures of mental health. In 2021, Black teens were 63% more likely to have made a concrete suicide plan over the course of the past year than they were in 2011. Teens in general were only 38% more likely to have done so, and 75% more likely to have attempted suicide. The average increase among all teens was 25%. Complex social phenomena can rarely be attributed to a single cause. A range of factors, from increased social media use to less free play, may play a role in teen depression overall, and Black teen depression in particular. But there is one possible explanation for these disturbing figures that is less often talked about: the virtuous lie that we tell about the prevalence of racism in the United States.
Can I mention one thing,
please,
about that? So he provides a couple of links for the like the complex reasons, like social media and stuff. So there's 2 links he provides, if I remember right. And I looked at both of the links. Neither one of those distinguishes black rates as being higher. So yes, that might be an explanation for why overall suicide rates are higher, or overall depression is higher. But why it does not address why is it higher among Blacks. And he's using that, like he says, well, it's a complex thing and blah, blah, blah. And there's these other things, but then those things he attributes it to dismiss it, don't actually dismiss it. There, it just seemed dishonest to me. Like, and he's trying to talk about this lie. Well, you haven't established it's a lie. You've established nothing.
Yeah, he's setting it up, right? He's setting up that the virtuous lie is that racism is prevalent in the United States, and he's justifying that by suicide rates, which I find which I find to be very, very interesting. He's connecting suicide rates to racism. So, Tori, what did you think about that intro? Why don't you tell me your thoughts?
Yeah, I thought that he didn't, that there's nothing that really establishes the connection, right? Like, I think it's interesting that he says that that social phenomenon can rarely be attributed to a single cause, and then basically gave us 3.
Exactly, right? Like, I mean,
not only, like you immediately tapered the conversation down to just these 3 possibilities, and you've decided on one, but you haven't made any connection at all between that thing and this claim that you've made for any of the 3, let alone the one that you've decided is the thing.
Exactly.
And not at all addressing why would Black people be more influenced by social media than white people? Right. If anything, you would think it would be more white people, right? I mean, just for various reasons, access and things like that.
Right. Yeah, and the time frame.
Go Go ahead, Tori. You were saying the time frame. What about it?
Yeah, in the time frame between 2011 and 2021, like numerous things have happened in our world and the environment and the space around us that could contribute to that and fall differently on different people. There are so many reasons. And, immediately racism itself is one.
Yeah.
But it's entirely excluded from even being considered immediately.
Except as a virtuous lie, right? Except as like an illusory reason that people try to use to explain it. So let's continue on. Let's see how he attempts to justify the virtuous lie of racism in the United States. It continues. A virtuous lie is a false or dubious claim that is asserted without qualification because it is thought to advance an ethical agenda. Interesting. Well-intentioned falsehoods like this exaggerate, indeed, often catastrophize, the extent and scope of genuine problems in order to draw more attention to them in the hopes of resolving them. What in the world? That one. He starts out by saying it's a false or dubious claim. Then he continues by saying it takes real problems. So it's a real problem that's a false and dubious claim that's catastrophized, although it really exists. However, the only reason these people are pushing them is not to solve these problems that actually exist, but also are dubious, is to get more people paying attention to them in the hopes of resolving them, which is a problem because they're dubious and false. Like, what?
Yeah.
I mean,
because they're real doesn't mean they're real.
Right, exactly. Like, I'm like, what
silliness is that?
It's like you can literally read in this writing sometimes, like, the inner turmoil or the inner conflict, like, it's very difficult for people, and you see it on social media too, to fully say that racism doesn't exist. Okay. Like, one of the people I talked to recently, even though he doesn't believe race means anything but skin color, he still couldn't really deny that racism was a thing. And so people have a very difficult time denying that, but this is one of the most pretzely winding roads to try to do that I've ever read. It's very interesting.
I think also that was the part that made me want to do this, because it really seems like that's what's happening in this article. That what you're trying to do is catastrophize the idea that racism affects things, and that's being overused, that and creating higher suicide rates is what we're trying, like, how we're tying all of this together. This and other people are doing this, but not you.
Isn't that so interesting? Yeah. I mean, it's the layers is incredible.
Like trying to suggest that black teens are committing suicide because liberal white people are guilty, and trying to make it seem like racism is worse than it is. So
exactly. Because people are catastrophizing racism in their minds. Black people are hearing that message and somehow just like sucking it up like chocolate milk and just like taking it in, and it's like creating inner turmoil in us that makes us want to commit suicide at higher rates. It's batshit crazy. I don't know what else to say about it. It is I don't know who could think about that and think that that's a rational or reasonable argument, but
somebody trying to rationalize racism.
I know, right? I've heard it. I've heard so many different ways of doing it, but every time I'm still shocked because I'm just like, y'all are the same logic and reason crowd. Do you hear yourselves? Like, sometimes I'm just like, man.
And these guys are both professors.
Well, Professor Mackey is, and then Julian is a consultant and a writer. Yeah, but yeah, I mean. Yeah, it's disappointing. It's disappointing to see. He goes on. We tell virtuous lies not only in order to change the world for the better, but in order to showcase our allegiance to the noble causes that they promote. This whole like championing a cause idea, right? Like that nobody could be doing something because they actually genuinely want to make a difference about the problem. It's all like your self-image is you as the hero, right? Like it seems to be centered in this rather than, hey, these people are fighting against this problem, and that's like the work that they do, you know?
And you know, like as I was reading it, I find the irony, and essentially that is what he is doing. He's the one telling the virtuous lies. He's the one sitting there trying to champion this noble made up cause that he's the real victim of racism, you know,
Yes.
like
Yeah.
he's actually this is a closeted confession to me, this entire article.
Wow. I didn't think about it that way, but that tracks fully. So, in our hyperpolarized and censorious world, one way to protect ourselves from the accusation that we don't care about issue X is to speak in hyperbolic terms about the severity of issue X. And I love how it's we, right? Like he's always roping everyone in as if like we're all doing the same thing here. Like this is just commonplace in what everyone does. The problem is that virtuous lies don't necessarily make the world a better place. In fact, they may end up harming the very people they are intended to help. So that is his premise again, right? The virtuous lie that racism, I don't even know how it's virtuous, that racism is prevalent in our society. People think they're making the world a better place by suggesting that, not that it could actually be true. And the impact of creating that virtuous lie is that Black people are hurt by it because they internalize that message and it makes them feel despair that then causes them to take their own life. I mean, how do we have any red string? Do we have some thumbtacks? You know, let's draw a web here because that's what's going on. All right, let's keep going. He goes on. We can see this dynamic at work in one of the most prominent virtuous lies told in the modern US. The idea that almost everything about America is racist. The University of Washington's, quote, IT Inclusive Language Guide, end quote, for example, specifies that the reference to a, quote, brown bag lunch, end quote, is racially problematic.
Okay, let me interject something here.
Go ahead.
So I did not know this. I looked up brown bag. And what it was is back in the days of segregation, if you went to a place that had practiced segregation, they would hold a brown bag next to you. And if you were darker than the brown bag, you couldn't get in. If you were lighter than the brown bag, you could get in. So there's like real, you know, like I think he's trying to suggest that people are upset that the word brown is in there. Not that there is a real, actual racist cultural history attached to brown bags. And, you know, like if you know that, then yeah, that word could be offensive. And that's what happened is this university went and they looked at some different things. And I think another one that he mentions is field work, right? And these are not like some big, you know, push to do it. These were just institutions that did a self-audit and said, okay, let's not use these words because they could be racially offensive. That's all.
Which I consider, you know, to be like the absolute bare minimum of, you know, like, I mean, frankly, the reality of racism in our society, like no one's like hearing the word field work and like going home and crying. You know what I mean? Like we've got bigger problems on our hands than whether people are using field work or, you know, inclusive language or not. But like even that tiny, some might even argue performative decision to remove those labels is considered somehow a dynamic of virtuous lies to the authors. Yeah. So I found that interesting that if these are virtuous lies, like what is like a greater, higher level of anti-racism work? What is that? What is that? You know, like I feel like we're on the path, you know, like this is the beginning of the path that leads to anti-racism is racism. You know what I mean?
Yes, exactly that.
These are like when you get into some things that are linguistic culture, that these are subtle things that they're not like overt. It's not like you said somebody's going to go field work, but it's the amalgamation of those things that
Mhm.
are in our culture that uh contribute to unconscious racism and the perpetuation of it. And so, like, just being sensitive to those things, it's like it doesn't hurt. It's like,
Yeah,
okay, so you don't call it field work. Who does that hurt?
right,
Who does it hurt to call it, to not say brown paper bag? It's not like there's any real harm that comes from not using that, but to just actually be sensitive and think about, well, gee, if not saying this is going to not bother somebody, then why should I just not say it?
right.
I think you nailed it there. Like, I mean, that's the issue, right? Is that a lot of a lot of what I feel like politically we're arguing about at this point is like the value of human dignity and just like
Mhm.
human respect. We're at the bottom of the barrel. We're literally at foundational like human respect and dignity at this point. And so it's appalling to me that these are the conversations we have to have, but hey, we got to start somewhere, right? And I agree with you that these are like the bare minimum actions that one can take if you recognize a racial historical legacy that you could be perpetuating. And this is just the tiniest sliver of a correction, and it's a virtuous lie that is leading to black people killing themselves. I mean, give me a break. So, yeah, so you were right about field work. That's how it continues here. It goes on to say, the School of Social Work at the University of Southern California decided to stop using the word field, as in field work, because it is racist. In 2018, NPR informed its listeners. By the way, sorry, just pause for a second. It says because it is racist. Notice all that context, right, NPK, that you gave us, that is totally absent from that statement. It is racist. And
Right.
yeah, so unless you like actually investigate, right, you're never going to find out that historical legacy. You're never actually going to wrestle with whether it really makes sense to eliminate brown bag, field work or brown bag lunch, based on that legacy. You're just going to see it is racist. And if you're already primed, right, to be like, oh, everything's racist now, even brown bags, then you're just going to read that and it'll just reaffirm your priors, right?
And their thinking with fieldwork was not just about Africans and slavery. It's also with Latinos
Yeah, migrant
and
workers, exactly.
migrants and all of that kind of, like, there is. And it's like, and then like it'll go on. It talks about the master and like it went into computer science with like the master drive and slave drive, things like that. And nobody's like sitting there thinking that the slave drive is an actual slave.
Right.
But it's like, why have those things in our language at all when we don't have to?
It's
Yeah.
kind of the same argument about the statues, the Confederate statues, right? Like, why do we need to? We're not saying we need to like set dynamite on these and blow them up, but like, why do we need to prominently display these in our institutions and our places of power, given the history of the people who we are enshrining in these marble statues and whatnot? These are important questions that lead to an enlightenment about racism in the history and legacy of the United States.
Two examples that come to mind. Fort Benning with Trump, he just recently made this big thing about Fort Benning. And it's so I like looked up who is this General Benning guy? And he wasn't just a Confederate general. He was a hardcore Confederate general. He thought that the South, half the South didn't go far enough in protecting slavery. Like
Mm.
he was he was 100% one of those guys that was like, you know, the North, like Dred Scott, Dred Scott was the moral and righteous decision to him. He's just a terrible, terrible person. And sure, and they talk about the heritage, and it's like, what if you're a black soldier and you're assigned at that base and your ancestors were owned by his ancestors, or by him. Like, do you want to go like and it's just like, what is the big deal about changing the name? Like,
Yeah.
it's not like, are they going to be trained differently? Are they not going to learn their job as well? And the other one is oh, I can't think of her name right now, the congresswoman that's from Somalia.
Yeah, you're talking about Rashida Tlaib.
Yeah,
Or
Tlaib.
no. You're talking about um. No, wait. Are you talking about Rashida Tlaib, or are you talking about what's her name?
Omar.
Omar. Yeah.
Omar.
Ilhan. Yeah, Ilhan Omar.
She tweeted something about, somebody said something about Somalians, and she tweeted, "We prefer to be called Somalis." And all of these people started posting, you know, screen caps of the dictionary where it says Somalians. Of course, there's also screen caps of it also has the definition for Somalis. You, and it's like, okay, yeah, you're going to use the colonizer's word for it instead of, and it's just like, she's from there. Like, what does it hurt you to just call Somalis Somali? It's not like it's going to cost you extra money. It's not even an extra syllable, and it's just.
But I like that these things happen because it shows people that what it's all about is power. Okay, even in that small micro context, it's about power. The power to be able to call you whatever I want and to not face any consequences. To not have to adjust to you. You adjust to me.
Exactly.
I call you what I want.
Me, you know what? It's just, be an asshole or don't be an asshole. That's what it comes down to.
Right?
Like, if I call you what you asked to be called, I'm not doing some, like, I'm not virtue signaling or something. I'm just choosing to not be an asshole.
And there we are with the human dignity and respect again, right? Like it's the bare minimum. All right, let's go on. So in 2018, NPR informed its listeners that, quote, white tears are racist, while the New York Times berated real estate agents for using the term master bedroom. Ibram X. Kendi, popularizer of the term anti-racism, has argued that standardized tests are, quote, the most effective racist weapon ever devised to objectively degrade black and brown minds and legally exclude their bodies from prestigious schools, end quote. Even if a black student somehow succeeds, despite Kendi's concerns, in joining a STEM department, it matters little. Because according to an article in the peer-reviewed biology journal Cell, today, black scientists continue to suffer institutional slavery. And it's not just black scientists. According to a group of activists dubbed, quote, 13ers, by historian Daryl Michael Scott, slavery was never abolished, but lives on through the 13th Amendment.
Okay, can I address some of that?
Please.
Because the whole white, like, going back to the white tears thing, what's ironic is, so I read that article that he links to, and it's not really NPR, it's just a writer, I can't remember her name.
Let me pull it up here just so we could take a look. The writer's name is Leah Donnella, and it looks like it's part of
it's
Code Switch, maybe, or something, like a Code Switch article. I don't know. Anyways, go on.
But the gist of the article is, white tears are what black people call it when you try to have an honest conversation about race with white people, about white privilege or something, and then they have the kind of reaction like writing a stupid article about virtuous lies. Like, the article is white tears. Like, that's, I found ironic. But then okay, so then in terms of, so then the master bedroom thing.
That's right.
I went and I read the Times article, and it's the Times is not arguing that it's bad, like he said, or that you have to do away with master bedrooms. But there was a group of realtors that during the Rodney, during the George Floyd thing, looked and said, maybe we shouldn't call it the master bedroom. They just started evaluating their own language, like we were talking about. And then some others were like, this could be kind of petty. And so they just presented the discussion. They didn't really present a side to it. And then so then you go to the he talks about the SATs. They love to think that SATs are, like merit based, but the fact is that they're not really that merit based. There is significant cultural differences between the scores for white people and black people, and a lot of that has to do with the wealth differences between white people and black people. White people can study for them a lot more than black people can, and studying them helps you do better. So they're like, oh, well, white people do better than black people, therefore it's meritorious, and then then you get into affirmative action and all of that, and so they use that to denounce affirmative action, and then it's like they really need to have that argument.
Oh yeah, 100%. It's foundational. Yeah.
So they dismiss out of hand the fact that there is a big racial distinction, and then so then then I looked at um
You looked
the
at the
article
biology article in Cell.
biology and the racial, and they make a big thing about this institutional slavery. And then, but if you go and you look at the like what they said, they define what they mean by institutional slavery, and like after the Civil War, and after everybody was freed, there was still institutional slavery in the form of sharecropping and arresting people for loitering and forcing them to work off their fines or whatever. And then that still exists in like equally qualified black people and white people in the science industry. They make less money, they're less likely to get promoted, all kinds of distinctions there. And the article makes this, and he just kind of glosses over the fact that this is a peer-reviewed article, right? He even says it's peer-reviewed, but he's like using that as like a negative. Oh, this is peer-reviewed. Oh, those stupid peers. And so, and then of course the 13th Amendmenters, I don't need to tell you guys about that. Like the 13th Amendment really is institutionalized slavery.
Yeah, pretty explicitly. Yeah. So yeah, so
around here. Sorry.
no. Go ahead. You were saying?
Oh, things are getting pretty rough around here.
Oh yeah.
Somebody's dog was commenting. So.
Mine, yeah, she's excited.
She was just agreeing with you, but yeah, like I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with what you were saying there. The article, particularly the Cell article, they're talking about the legacy of slavery, right, and the continuing impacts of that today, and it's very clearly saying that. And it's just glossed over, like you said. Like you said, he's again doing the very thing that he is railing against, right? He's catastrophizing, he's hyperbolizing, he's making these implications to try to show that a problem is bigger than it actually is. It's very, I mean, it would be clever if it wasn't so, like, I don't know, just gross to me. But yeah.
Yeah. The thing that I thought when I read that body of text is like, one, the context is trying to give it is that all these things are absurd.
Yeah.
But even if they were, that doesn't prove their thesis here.
Yeah.
Like, even if all of those things are absurd ways to view these things, and they are silly little ideas that aren't really racist, that doesn't back up your claim of a virtuous lie. It doesn't disprove racism. It, at most, it proves that there are people out there who have a different opinion of racism. People who maybe they think go too far and say absurd things. They're not absurd, as you dug into and found, but like, even if they were, they wouldn't mean that racism doesn't exist. Like,
yeah.
That people are being told, or that racism is exaggerated in its scope.
Exactly. You're right. And it's kind of, I find in a lot of these articles that are trying to diminish racism or suggest that racism is being overblown, right? In a lot of these types of articles, there's this winding, weaving narrative, right? That's like very nebulous. And I think you kind of described it well. Like, it's not actually ever bolstering their argument, you know? It's just kind of a bunch of implications. You know, we're going to throw out these implications, you know? I don't know if you saw It's Always Sunny. I don't know if I should even reference that episode, but because of the implication, like that's kind of the feeling I'm getting from that. All right, let's keep on with the read along.
Brilliant show, by the way.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, here we go. So, as if modern slavery were not enough, Black Americans today also face a kind of genocide, according to law professor Kimberly Crenshaw, creator
Genocide,
of the concept.
We're not hyperbolizing here.
Right, exactly. I'm just gonna pull the most extreme language I possibly can from this person, just so that you guys connected to, critical race theory and intersectionality, which is what he does here. He says, according to law professor Kimberly Crenshaw, creator of the concept of intersectionality. Why does he say that? Why would he call her the creator of the concept of intersectionality? Of all the things he could call her, right? Like, and all the things she is. So that just drove me nuts. And then in 2020, she wrote that Black people are subjected to, quote, racial terror, similar to that of the slavery and Jim Crow eras at the hands of police and vigilantes, which is just like a fact. So I don't know what he was trying to do there. What did you guys think of that part?
Like, they didn't even make any effort to address those things. They just said them in the most obviously this is absurd way. Like you didn't even try to, why is this bad? What's wrong with that?
Oh, he did. He went a step further. I'll wait until Contraband reads it, but he actually misrepresented. He lied. He fallaciously misrepresented the actual reality, and I'll explain how once you've read it.
All right, let's get there. So he goes, virtuous lies like these spread, echoed by sympathetic outlets and voices, until the underlying ideas have penetrated deep into the mainstream. For example, I don't know what the mainstream is in this context, but for example, in a recent survey, 54% of very liberal respondents believed that between 1,000 and 10,000 unarmed Black Americans are killed by police every year. In another major survey, 80% of African American respondents thought that a young Black man was more likely to be shot and killed by police than to die in a traffic accident. These beliefs, thankfully, bear no resemblance to reality. In 2020, 7,494 African Americans were killed in traffic accidents. That same year, 242 African Americans were killed by police, only 18 of them unarmed. All three of these numbers are too high, but the number of traffic deaths is orders of magnitude higher than the other two. Black people should be far more concerned about automobile safety than about fatal unarmed encounters with cops.
Okay, so we've got I like to call them fallacy bombs because you just notice conservatives do this a lot. They wrap a whole bunch of fallacies together. And so then it's hard to even know which fallacy to address first. But first of all, he's, I looked at the thing and he's actually accurately representing these surveys. There were whatever it was, 54% of people that call themselves very liberal whites believed that it was 1,000, and it is only 13 unarmed Blacks that were killed in 2019. And he said it's every year, but it was actually only 2019. But the question then is, why is it only unarmed Blacks? The guy in Brooklyn Park that was trying to show, he had a gun license, he was legally carrying a gun, and he was trying to reach in, and you remember that, and he was in his car,
Oh,
and
there's several stories like this,
I
so it's
can't
not
remember.
one. Yeah.
Definitely
Then
remember.
he just got shot to hell. So he was an armed person, right? But he was not a threat.
Right.
So, like that notion of unarmed black people, like, that's not very good. And why I'd like to see how many armed black people versus armed white people. Like, you see armed white people get treated with, like, you never see armed white people getting shot. It's always the black people. And then the other thing is that still 24%, even according to his survey, 24% of black people, or 24% of the shootings were black, but only 12% of the population is black. And then it was the Latinos were also shot at a higher rate than whites. So there's, like, if you look at the ratio of people that are shot by race, there is racism in police shootings, whether they're armed or unarmed.
And I think that
And
like
then,
a lot of people try to justify that disparity in the numbers by saying, well, these are the people who are committing more crime. Of course the police are going to be more violent with them and are going to shoot them, right? But the
but then
wrinkles,
it's like, even if they are committing a crime, what kind of crime?
right? Yeah,
Are they
of
a threat?
course.
Like Mike, like the guy in Madison, he had a knife on him, right? But he was not a threat when you're shooting him in the back. Like,
Mm.
would he have been shot if he was white reaching into his car? And it's not to say that white people are never shot.
Yeah, as
Uh,
it does happen. In fact, they get shot more. Like I mean, not proportionally more, but like
yeah.
like numbers wise, they get shot a lot. I mean, and not just shot. This is the other thing I want to bring up, MPK, is that when people are using this data, they use shootings, but police kill people in a lot of ways. People would
Right, right.
be shocked if they actually investigated. I have literally watched cops burn people alive, freeze people to death, strangle people to death, tase people to death. These killings are not categorized in the same way. Sometimes they're not
And it's
even
not just
categorized as
killing.
the police did it.
Right, right. And it's not just killings. What about
Yeah.
just taking somebody and beating the shit out of them? Like, so
Yeah.
this idea that, so he's trying to characterize it as that black people are unfairly afraid of police,
Right.
as though they, I don't know a single person personally that has ever been beaten by police, had a gun drawn on them by police.
You actually do, brother, right here.
Okay, a single white person, I'll say, right? I don't know how many black people don't know somebody, aren't even related to somebody that doesn't have a story to tell, you know?
Yeah, I think
And
Neil deGrasse Tyson was talking about being with a group of scientists sharing their police encounter stories and noticing the exact same thing, that all the black people had these stories, and all the racialized white scientists were like, oh wow, like I can't relate, So yeah.
Yeah.
it's like,
I
one
think
time, I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm
I,
hogging the time.
I think another like important thing. So in addition to everything that you guys said, especially about like the things that aren't death, that there aren't other police.
Mhm.
So like people experiencing those kinds of conditions from our police officers is, it's not just, oh, the numbers are too high. It's like, who else would be there? Who else is supposed to be protecting and serving? There's nobody other than the actual police. And you're saying that like encounters with them could end in, assault and possibly even death. And we're just like, it's a little high. Like,
Exactly.
calm down. Also, the comparison to vehicle death is crazy because we all assume a certain amount of risk driving cars. That same thing should not be said of our encounters with the folks who are supposed to protect and serve.
And that's where, like, that's another, I wanted to draw attention to this fallacy. How much time do you spend a year in your car? like
A lot.
hundreds of hours, right?
Yeah.
Do you
Right.
spend hundreds of hours in police encounters? Like just by virtue of the fact you're spending 1,000 times much in a car, you're going to have higher rates.
Yeah.
Very good point. Very good point. I like that you guys are bringing this stuff up because, like, what you're showing right now is how people misuse statistics to try to bolster their point, right? Like, there's so many confounding variables here that we're not dealing with to come to these conclusions. And you've got to be very wary of doing that no matter what your position is. You know, as a mathematics instructor, I run into people trying to do it all the time. And I got to clip people all the time and be like, no. All right. Like, make sure that your conclusions that you're coming to are based on the actual mathematical analysis, okay, which is much more limited than what people try to use it for. So just be careful with that, guys. If you ever go into statistical analysis or data analysis, like, you need to make sure that you're using the actual mathematic techniques that you learn in your classes and in your schooling, and not kind of go with what's in your gut, you know, or what's in your heart or what's in your feelings to reach a conclusion and then try to back justify it with math. Very frustrating.
Right now, I encourage everybody to take a propositional logic course. Basically, what that is that it's mapping out arguments mathematically. It's changing your argument, your premise, and everything like that into math equations and figuring out, is this an honest conversation?
Yep.
One of my favorite mathematics I ever learned, and actually in undergrad. Yes, I highly recommend that as well. It's not as scary and hard as people think, and it's actually it can really help you demystify mathematics in general a little bit, and it also helps you make a more solid connection to the math that you learned when you were younger to something tangible and real, which is like the thoughts in your mind, you know, and the arguments that you construct. So yeah, really good point.
It's probably not a course you can take that will apply more in your job, in real life, in your other courses. Like, learning to think logically is like the most powerful tool in your arsenal.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, these guys, these authors, are the ones who hold themselves out as being the logic and region bros, and we can see here that black people should be far more concerned about automobile safety than about fatal unarmed encounters with cops. It's just an absurd statement on so many different levels, and there's so many fallacies involved in coming to that conclusion. So thank you guys for your thoughts on that. All right, let's keep going here. The virtuous lie that racism is ubiquitous also manifests in fatalistic statements about how hard it is for Black Americans to succeed. In their book, Is Everyone Really Equal?, Oslin Sensoy and Robin DiAngelo, of white fragility fame, argue that members of racial minorities, quote, do not hold political, economic, and institutional power, end quote, in the United States. This conveniently ignores the countless Black men and women who have risen to positions of power in government, business, academia, and other sectors. Pretty sure we can count them pretty easily, actually. But worse, it sends a message of disempowerment to young Black people. If one benefit of affirmative action is that it helps young Black Americans to see people like themselves in positions of power, then the message of DiAngelo and Sensoy is disaffirmative action. No one who looks like you has achieved anything in this country.
Where has anybody argued that affirmative action, the goal is that Black people can see people like themselves in power?
Right.
I have never heard that an argument.
Yeah, because it's not an argument. It's not an argument that people make. It's a consequence, right, of affirmative action, because it gives people an opportunity to get in those positions of power where before they were kept out, you know, through a legacy of white supremacy. So in that way, a role model then consequently is there for Black people to admire. But it was never the intention of affirmative action to give Black people role models, you know, like that was no one's driving force.
It's ironic that Clarence Thomas is a beneficiary of affirmative action.
Oh yeah. Oh gosh, we could do a whole discussion on Clarence Thomas.
I've said about that regularly.
All
But
right, let's keep.
also,
Yeah, you got anything you want to say about this part, Tori? About the
yeah, the idea that there are exceptions somehow invalidates everything. Like, yes, of course, there are people who exist. Like, there are millionaires, there are billionaires. That doesn't mean we can all be millionaires, billionaires. Like the existence of those folks doesn't um invalidate the very real challenges that people experience because of class or race or other things. Like, the fact that there's famous women doesn't invalidate sexism.
Right.
So, like, the argument is not being made. Like, just continually, it's just an assertion, and like, don't you agree, kind of nod wink wink, that, but you haven't made a point. You haven't bolstered your case in any way at all.
yeah,
Mhm. Like they love to use the example of Barack Obama, right? Who was and Michelle, both of them I think were um affirmative action acceptances in college. Then they say, well, but this, oh, my cat's gonna drop in on the conversation. Say hi, Care Bear. So
hello.
but like they always use Barack Obama as an example. Oh, see, one out of 45 presidents has been black. See, that just and then it's like, okay, but and then like you bring up Barack Obama issued in Donald Trump, the most racist president since the Civil War. Like it's just mind-boggling that they come up with this exception disproves the rule kind of nonsense like you're talking about.
And it for me, it's like I map out this argument for this particular paragraph, and what I see is someone saying, okay, it's the same argument from the beginning, but I think this one is somehow just because it's kind of like a microcosm based on affirmative action. I find it even more absurd, which is that, oh, black youth are going to feel disaffected because people are telling them that other black people do not hold a significant amount of institutional power in the United States. I'm like, what do y'all think black youth are thinking about? What do you think black youth are talking about? What do you think people are mentoring black youth and say? Do you really think people are sitting black kids down and being like, all right, listen, guys, we're powerless. All right. Let me just start there. Okay. Like, I mean, not only that, but like, do you really think that black youth are just like empty cups waiting to be filled by whatever someone is filling in? They live in this country. They
Right.
experience this environment. They
Yeah.
see Donald Trump acting a fool as the president of the United States and making racist statements about immigrants and about black people. Like, it's not like they cannot perceive these things. It's not like I didn't have someone on my show who was racialized white, but he was half Mexican. And it's not like he wasn't in the cafeteria, his middle school cafeteria, and had a kid stand up and pretend like he was calling ICE and say that, oh, we got an illegal here. We need you to come get him and take him out. Like, these are things that students experience. It's not like when I was 6 years old, someone didn't tell me I didn't act black because I got good grades, because I didn't curse, because I wasn't in a gang. It's not that like people don't get told that I didn't get told when I got into Duke University for undergrad that I only got in because I was affirmative action acceptance, even though both my parents worked at Duke. like like these are literal things that people experience. Kids don't need someone to tell them what's going on. They can literally just exist in the world and they learn for themselves because that's the reality of the environment in which they are existing. Like,
Yeah.
so it really frustrates me that people think that we need to create some kind of illusory environment or illusory world to brainwash kids into thinking that they're powerless. What would be the goal? What would be the point?
Yeah.
It's just so illogical and so outside of like a realistic understanding of our of black people's existence, first of all, but also just of what people are doing in reality. Like, who can you point to who would proudly raise their hand and be like, "Oh yeah, I tell black people they're powerless," and that
Right.
you know, like those people are not out there. They're not saying it. If they are out there, they're being very very quiet, you know, and um,
Are
it's
you suggesting white people shouldn't be telling black people what it's like to be black?
no, I would never say yes. I mean, you know, that's this whole article, right? Which is just like, oh, these poor black youth, these poor black people, what are we doing to them by telling them that racism is affecting them? Like, it is just the most patronizing.
It really is.
I just, I'm embarrassed, you know, for them, you know, to be honest, when I read it.
And I feel like what MPK was talking about, what Kelly was talking about the fallacy bombs, it is like, even if we accepted the premise, like, let's say that happens and everybody gets to sit down and they get to hear about the world they're up against, and you know, racism that they never experienced is somehow infused into them at the, you know, the age of 10 or something, when we all have the conversation. Even if that was the case, there's no reason to draw the conclusion that that produces in them this like despair.
Yeah, this catastrophic result of like super high suicide rates, you know,
Like,
Yeah,
thanks,
like
Dad. I'm gonna go kill myself now. You know what I mean?
help.
yeah,
Like it doesn't follow. What if then they take that information and just have a better understanding of the world around them, and they're able to achieve, like, you can't say that it only ends one way or primarily ends one way. There are numerous ways, even if people were having those conversations and children were being exposed to those conditions by somebody just saying it.
very good point.
Which is ironically, they're trying to defend and saying that the racism isn't there. But inherently, they're making a racist argument in that, suggesting that if black people are confronted with adversity, they're just going to give up.
Yeah.
Like, you know, black children, you know, white kids, they're going to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? But black people, those black kids, they're just going to go off themselves because it's life's just too big of a challenge.
That's right. Yeah, that's the argument here. And they go on to like kind of go down that line to say, um, it sends a message of disempowerment to young black people. If one benefit of affirmative action is that it helps young black Americans to see people like themselves in positions of power, then the message of D'Angelo and Sinsoy is disaffirmative action. No one who looks like you has achieved anything in this country. Yeah, just the extreme nature of those statements is interesting.
And it avoids the actual honesty of it. Like, there is an actual wealth disparity in race.
Yeah.
There is an actual disparity in our justice system. You are more likely to go to prison if you're black. Like, the systemic racism that exists, they never actually discuss.
Exactly.
Right.
Like, those are real things, and they're measurable. And
Yeah.
so, like, one thing I always say is, if you don't, like, they're like, oh, you know, we got to be colorblind. And it's like, if you don't see race, how can you see racism? Like, you can't evaluate whether racism exists without looking at the demographics of things like that.
Yeah.
So
Cody says in the chat here, these are the kinds of people who think talking about the problem makes it worse and ignoring it is the best option. I wholeheartedly agree. That definitely seems
Yes.
right in line. So it goes on here. For some on the farther reaches of the progressive left, I hate left and right, and I hate the way that started, but we're going to continue. It's considered acceptable to claim that minorities lack any agency at all. Where is that considered acceptable? I don't know. They are crushed beneath a vast racist machinery that they cannot hope to escape. How can you escape racist machinery in a society based on racism? But according to D'Angelo and Sinsoy, quote, the logic of individual autonomy that underlies liberal humanism, the idea that people are free to make independent rational decisions that determine their own fate, is a mechanism for keeping the marginalized in their place by obscuring larger structural systems of inequality, end quote. That is, if you're a black American and you think you can get ahead through your own efforts, you're deluded. You've fallen for the propaganda American society spouts to hide its racism.
I'm sorry, can you reread that last part? Because
yeah,
that did not make it. It sounded to me like he was saying that The liberals are trying to obscure the racism.
No, he's saying that D'Angelo and Sensoy make this claim, and the claim is that the logic of individual autonomy that underlies liberal humanism, right? So this whole liberal humanism movement, which is the idea that people are free to make independent, rational decisions that determine their own fate, which is just like a fact of our existence as human beings. But like, you know, he's saying that they're saying that it's a mechanism for keeping the marginalized in their place by
Are they
obscuring
actually
larger
saying that, or is
systems.
he saying they're saying that?
He's saying that they're saying that. Yeah. He's saying that they're saying that. And he says that is, if you're a black American and think you can get ahead through your own efforts, you're deluded. You've fallen for the propaganda American society spouts to hide its racism. I actually
Which
think that this is like the closest to to accurate the thing that he writes, because
yeah, that's actually he's
like it's pretty
so like
close
this is their
to
lie, but it's
reality.
actually true.
I mean, the only thing that I would argue against it is like nobody thinks that you can't get ahead. It's just like you have to get it. You do have to face obstacles to get ahead that other people don't have to face, because
Right.
we have this racial hierarchy under which we are, under which we exist, where black people are placed at the bottom. That creates a more difficult path. But no one is saying don't travel the path. No one
Right.
is saying do not travel the path. No one would ever say that. But I will say that my own experience was as a black American who was deluded that I could get ahead through my own efforts. That's what I was taught. That's what I was raised to believe. And that is how I operated. Just that, like, as long as I work hard, as long as I show my strengths, as long as I, lead with integrity, that I'm going to be recognized and I'm going to be rewarded for that, because we live in a society that rewards those things. And what
Yeah.
happened? I ran into racism at every turn. I ran into classism at every turn. I ran into these structural barriers that stopped me from advancing and achieving my goals that I had set for myself. Not because I didn't have the merit, not because I didn't perform well or execute or somebody was better than me. It was literally, and I know this by confirmation in many cases, um, classism or racism. And so I was that deluded black American, like just going for it, like just trying to give it my all and show what I have to offer the country. But you realize after getting beaten back unjustly time after time after time, after getting denied benefits that you've earned, after being given certificates and awards for merit, but not giving no tangible benefits go along with that, you start realizing that there is this barrier that exists. And I was forced to come to terms with the barrier of racism that I encountered over and over and over and over and over again, no matter what context I was in professionally. And I'm still dealing with it today, to this day. I still deal with racism regularly in my professional environment. And it does still impact and hamper my efforts to advance professionally. So what should I do? Should I pretend that doesn't exist? I feel like sometimes that's the argument they're making. Like, just pretend like it's fine. All right? Because that makes me more comfortable. It just makes all of us more comfortable, right?
Yeah.
Anyways.
That's exactly the sentiment. Like, yeah, that if we just ignored it, and yeah, I often ask, like, what's the real benefit of that? Like, where are the instances where we like are better at achieving things when we don't know what we're up against? What are the instances where we're empowered by our doe-eyed optimism, where we're just gonna go through the world and whatever comes, and we just believe that it's all going to be okay, like sunshine and rainbows. Like, even the only instance that I thought of was like something scary. Like, if you don't know that there's something scary in there, then you might be able to do it. But then if you encounter the scary thing, like if you're like, go down this tunnel, there's an axe murderer in there. Yeah, you're going to be scared, but at least you know to not like talk to the guy if you like encounter him. Like, there's no situation where it's better to not know what you're up against.
You know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of when I went to law school at Fordham, and Fordham is a Jesuit school, and I get a phone call from one of the professors there, and she's like, "Hey, I just wanted to call and let you know that it's totally okay to be gay coming to Fordham. Like, you don't have anything to be worried about. It's going to be totally fine. And I was like, wait, should I be worried? I was just like, wait a minute, wait, what? Like, do I? Is there a problem? Do I need to like? She was like, oh my god, no. Like, and I was like, yeah, but like, you thought you had to call me, so obviously there is some kind of concern. That's what your story kind of reminded me of. Like, I was taught the opposite in terms of race, right? That like, oh, even if something does happen, just ignore it, like it's, you just keep going. And that's what I did for a long time. But like slowly but surely, I kept seeing over and over. I was like, me ignoring it doesn't stop it, you know?
Right.
And the consequences of the racism that I experienced kept getting greater and greater and greater. We're talking, I was eventually losing tens of thousands of dollars and finding out that it was because of racism. And like you said, it's not just people on the lower end of the economic spectrum here. There are two racialized black gentlemen who worked for a bank, and they made that bank hundreds of millions of dollars through a program that they developed, which was a program they developed in a kind of little like isolated silo that they were put in just to be put off to the side. But they ended up making the business hundreds of millions. And then what did they do after the business found out? They cut them off from the financial benefits of the program that they created and propagated. And they had to sue them. And now they're in that lawsuit right now. They've been into it for like almost 2 years now. And so it's just like, we have examples at every class level of racism. So I agree with you. I don't think that there's any benefit of going into these situations blind. And there is a significant benefit to going into it with knowledge, because you'll be prepared and you won't be caught off guard and unawares, and you'll be able to, navigate which a system that's hostile to you.
Yeah.
And I was totally unprepared to do that. I came into it with the mindset that everyone's going to see me as an equal, right? And everyone's going to treat me as an equal, and I'm going to be respected as a fellow legal colleague, just like everybody else. And that wasn't my experience. And so what about the devastation of that, right? That's something we never talk about. I was devastated. I went into a deep depression, realizing that nothing I could do would make me be looked upon, as just a law student, as just a legal scholar. Even my mentors, I told the story the other day. I won the highest prize, best advocate, of a mock trial competition that I represented, a fake problem in, right? I won the best advocate of all the individual advocates in the competition for my school. And everybody who does mock trial was in it. So, that was like number one. And what does my mentor tell me after I received the award? There's a ceremony and everything. She comes up and she's like, oh my God, she gives me a big hug. She's like, I'm so proud of you. She's like, but I never would have let you get up there with your hair looking like that.
Wow.
The first thing. And I'm like so excited, and I go to crestfallen in seconds, because I'm just like, why would you say that? Why would you say that? Like, I just won the highest award, and that is what you're thinking? Even if like there was something wrong with my hair, which there wasn't. I then went around asking 20 different colleagues, what do you think about my hair? And they're like, well, it's good. Like, but like, that what would happen if then I'm thinking, well, what would happen if the person who was adjudicating the competition thought that? Would I have won? Probably not. And now I have to think about, now I have to change my physical appearance just to make people comfortable in recognizing my merit, because maybe they won't recognize it if I have my hair a certain way. Like, to what extent do we have to go? And then to have someone write an article where they're like, oh, like, you've just been deluded that this thing is prevalent, when we're experiencing this continuous cascade of racist scenarios and situations that we have to navigate, especially at the upper echelons of academia, and the professional world in general. So yeah, that was a long little diatribe there, but that one got me a little bit.
Yeah.
From my perspective, which is obviously the opposite. Like, if you're a white person that isn't prejudicial towards Black people, at least consciously, you can evaluate how much racism is there by how much racism you personally manifest
Mhm.
and be oblivious to it around you, like the subtle or racisms like your hair. And so while I was kind of going through my epiphany, which was like took 3 years, I had this really good friend. He had a master's degree from the University of Minnesota. Couldn't get a job other than a temp job. We went shopping one day. We were on a road trip. We stopped at a gas station. We went inside. I'm wearing jeans and a t-shirt. He's wearing like suit pants and a tie. And the guy is the cashier is eyeballing him the whole time. And so I go up to him. I was like, I'm dressed like a slob. Why are you looking at him and not me? Trying to stick up for Edgar. And then we get outside. Edgar laughs at me. He's like, I know how to do this without your help. And so I was like, okay, I get what you mean. But so then we were talking later, and kind of it really struck me as a white person that's not consciously racist. My encounters with racism are only there when I'm like paying attention to it and are very rare. So I might think that racism is very rare. But Black people don't have that opportunity. So even if it's like only 5% of white people are overtly racist, and a Black person encounters 20 white people a day, this is what my logic was, then that means every single day a Black person is encountering racism and being forced to be aware of it. And like that really changed my whole perspective for everything. Like, just because I don't see racism doesn't mean it's not there.
Amen.
It doesn't, like, something we have to overtly pay attention to recognize it and see it. And it's like when I see articles like this, I see people that are like, because they're not using the N-word, they're not racist or something.
Exactly. I think that's very well said, sir.
About the left part, about like politicizing the race conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just that, I mean, like, I politically am an independent, and like there's no left right on it, on how I view race.
Same. 100% the same. And it really bothers me that it's characterized as a left right situation. Racism has never known a political side. You know what I mean? Like, racism is all purpose, So, yeah.
It's the right, wrong purpose.
Right. Exactly. All right. So let's continue on here with the article. For many on the left, here we go again. It's become an article of faith that nothing ever gets better, which means that race relations are still stuck in the antebellum period. Again, no one is thinking that. Right. For example, as Frank Wilderson III, a founding figure of Afro-pessimism, has it, nothing ever changes, and even today, blackness is coterminous with slaveness. George Packer has called this, quote, historical fatalism. As he puts it in The Atlantic, historical fatalism believes that nothing ever really changes. Mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow. Modern police departments are the heirs of slave patrols. Historical fatalism combines inevitability and essentialism. The present is forever trapped in the past and defined by the worst of it. Like, to me, the dude is just stating like historical facts. It is true that mass incarceration could be considered the new Jim Crow. I think that's a reasonable statement to make. I think I think that saying that modern police departments are the heirs of slave patrols, that's a historical fact. Right. Okay, so I don't understand why this is somehow hyperbolizing when we're just talking about true history here.
And it's not like just because... Do we still are things better than they were in 1861? Yes.
Undoubtedly.
Does that mean they're better? No, like there's gradients here.
100%. Exactly. Really important point. And it's something that I learned to say when I have these discussions with people. I always do just like say, I 100% agree that we've come very far. I do. I mean, I don't think that that's really arguable that in terms of race relations that we've come far. And I think that desegregation has a lot to do with that. Now that we're able to come in communion with people of different racial categories and realize that these divisions that were enshrined through the generations are really illusory.
That you kind of just blew, like I hadn't even thought about that before. But just desegregation, actually having white people talk to black people kind of changes things.
Exactly. And that's why I do the work that I do, to be honest, like is to give people that opportunity where they really tip a lot of people just never get the opportunity to talk to someone from a different racial group because they just like don't engage with them. They don't see those people. They're not in their friend groups. They're not going over to people's houses of different racial groups sometimes. And that has like kind of increased, the over time. And I do think that that's one of the major reasons why our racial environment has slightly improved. Now, I say slightly because ultimately the toxicity is still there, but the power has waned somewhat. And I think that's really the best way to describe how we've advanced personally.
Right.
Um,
And the evidence that the toxicity is still there is in the article that we are reading.
right?
Yeah.
100%. All right, here we go. He also then quotes sociologist Musa al-Garbi, sums up this catastrophizing strain of thought. For people of color, getting educated in America is to be cudgeled relentlessly with messages about how oppressed, exploited, and powerless we are, and how white people need to get it together to change this, but probably never will. It is hard to imagine a more demoralizing message. Yeah, it's very interesting that he's so
Right.
focused on the message that people are getting, but not the life that they're living.
Yeah.
The messages we're receiving are the most devastating things ever, but like the actual experiences with racism that we have are just neither here nor there.
Right. The only reason that you think there's racism is because you're taught that there's racism, not that you actually experience it.
Right.
Yeah, I think that as we're reading this aloud, also that it feels like the audience isn't Black people. It feels like the audience is first people who already agree with this, but secondly, like the sort of blue-haired liberal ladies that are perpetuating this and like really you should stop because it's dangerous for the people you're trying to do it for, and it really doesn't have anything to do with, with how Black people see this issue. It's largely not even at us, even though it's about us.
Yeah, and I think that you see that a lot in what I would argue are right wing or liberal publications on the subject of race, is that Black people, they may be the subject, but they're that's all. Like we're just a subject to be manipulated in whatever narrative is necessary. Actually communicating with Black people about it, actually engaging with Black people about these perspectives is not on the agenda ever. Especially when it's two racialized white people writing about Black despair. So it's just,
Yeah.
yeah, the height
Like you would
of,
think if you're gonna write about Black despair, could like talk to a Black person.
yeah,
Like,
it seems like it would be a good idea, I think.
The statement that it's hard to imagine a more demoralizing message, like you could have just you could have asked somebody there, like like several Black people to just tell you if there was a more demoralizing message. This article is more demoralizing than whatever that message is.
I so agree with that. All right, let's keep going. So it says, even at the top of society, life is almost unbearably bad for Black Americans, some prominent progressives claim. Writing in the New York Times. I love, by the way, that he talked all about hyperbole in the beginning, and then it's all this language that's like catastrophizing and hyperbole, and that's all that's in this. Even at the top of society, life is almost unbearably bad for Black Americans, some prominent progressives claim. Writing in the New York Times, Chris LeBron, associate professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins, describes being Black in America like this. Every day you feel like you're living with a knee on your neck. If even a professor at one of America's most prestigious universities believes that merely existing while Black is a life and death struggle, then the message to many young African Americans is clear. No matter how high you climb, every facet of your life will always be defined by racism. You know, there's this thing that I notice with people on social media do with these statements on race. They'll rephrase them, and through their rephrasing, they change the meaning. You know? And I feel like that's what happened there in that little section, you know? No matter how hard you climbed, every facet of your life will always be defined by racism. I don't think that's what he said. You know, I don't think that's even what he meant. But it does mean that you're going to experience racism at every class level, at every professional level. Yeah. I think we've seen evidence of that very clearly, and we don't need someone to tell us that. People actually experience it. Okay? So, yeah, it's so funny that inherent in the way that he's writing this is kind of an implicit admission that he does not understand Black people's lived experiences. You know?
And he's not trying to.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and also that he just doesn't, right? You know? It's very
Like
yeah.
the whole, even I thought knee on the neck, that's a pretty specific metaphor. And considering recent history, I think we can pretty good guess what he was referring to.
Oh, 100%. Definitely a George Floyd reference there. And, you know, it's so. This is one of the hallmark signs that someone is, at minimum, promoting white supremacy, is when they use Black trauma in an argument against anti-racism.
Yeah.
You know, so that he's using the George Floyd murder to try to talk about why we shouldn't be communicating with people about racism or anti-racism.
Yeah, he's using it to diminish racism.
Exactly.
Is just sort of twisted.
It is, and it goes on. Obviously, racism does exist in the United States. See, you have to say that, and this is whenever that is said, I always look to see whether there's like a but that comes after it. So let's see if we see the but.
The law of everything before the but is bullshit. Like
exactly. Let's see. So obviously racism does exist in the United States at both personal and institutional levels. Isn't that the opposite of what he was just saying the whole time? Commentator David French notes that his Black daughter is the target of harassment and of assumptions that she doesn't belong far more than his white children are. So now his evidence of that is one person's daughter. Like, how did we get from these statistics mean this to, well, this person's daughter says his daughter experiences it, and therefore clearly institutional and personal racism exists. What? Like,
and like, and if his daughter like experiences like everything else you would assume is the same, but his Black daughter experiences a different America than his white children, wouldn't that prove that there is something more than, you know, oh, you're being taught that you're hopeless or whatever?
Right. Like this girl didn't get the negative messaging, right? Because he obviously respects David French. So like you can assume that he's not thinking that she got that negative messaging. So what happened to her, huh? Like, you know, like it's incredible how he went right into a complete 180 against his argument. Nuts.
Yeah. In support of like someone he regards, like someone that he regards highly, and that is on the appropriate side of the political spectrum with them, that they're like, okay, the guy told us, and so we gotta admit there's some.
Oh yeah, like if the white guy with his Black daughter tells me, then I'll listen to him. You know.
What about people?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I don't even know if they realize, you know, I mean, I think it's very, very unlikely that they realize what they did there, you know? So let's go on. Criminologist Radley Balco has presented a persuasive, exhaustively researched case that there is a racist element to the U.S. criminal justice system. So have many other people. There's so much evidence and data. all Americans, whatever their skin color, should be committed to stamping out prejudice and institutionalized double standards like these whenever they encounter them. Yeah, shoulda, woulda, coulda, right? That's not the world we live in. We don't live in a country where people are constantly calling out double standards when they encounter them. That is not the world we live in. And how do I know that? Because I literally have people come to my racism discussion group and say they wish they had done X. They wish they had done Y in certain situations where they encountered these institutional barriers. So I know that people are not acting because they're confessing to me directly.
And here's like, so he's saying this exists, but the rest of the article is dismissing it.
Right.
Right. Now all this stuff I just spent all this time, they're hyperbolizing and everything like that. It's actually true, but don't let that bother you.
Exactly. And that's where this all leads to. Don't just shrug it off, like you're good. But telling virtuous lies about the scope
here we are. There's the but.
We're back. It's a lie.
Waiting for it.
It was true. Now we're back to it being a lie. So, but telling virtuous lies about the scope and impact of the racism that currently exists, which I don't know how he feels comfortable, evaluating that, in the United States will not help us do that. Instead, it is likely to simply increase depression and anxiety among Black people by encouraging a distorted, overly negative picture of the world. Distorted. So is it a distorted picture of the world, or is it the reality that you mentioned earlier, just in the paragraph above? We'll never know, because it's both, according to you.
You notice that it always comes down with these people. It always comes down to racism is there, but really it's Black people's fault.
Oh yeah, I mean, blame it on Black people. We're now getting blamed for airplane crashes or something.
Yes.
So yeah.
Even though there's not actually any, if they hire a Black pilot, then it's because he went to a historically Black college and is kind of like too stupid to fly a plane. I mean.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's just all made up, right? It's all imaginary. It's feelings all the way down, Tori, as you said before, and like I agree. It's just, this is pure feelings here, and this is definitely not scholarship, and I would say it's barely scholarship adjacent. So let's keep going. Let's see what else we got in store here. Gallup notes that in 2011, 65% of African Americans thought that relations between white and Black people were, quote, very good, or, quote, somewhat good. By 2021, that number had fallen to 33%. But this decline in perceived racial harmony does not reflect reality.
Based on what? And what changed between 2011 and 2021? Is it possible that there is a difference between 2011 and 2021? Who was president in 2011 and who was president? Well, by 2021 it was but the whole Trump thing did sort of juice up the racism a little bit. Like, and then it's a fact. Like, race related crimes went up 30%. Like, so he's just dismissing that there's possibility that Black people are perceiving reality.
And we see the same thing with Asian hate for the COVID-19 pandemic, when Trump started saying the Asian virus or whatever, China virus, and then people of all different Asian backgrounds started reporting an increase of people getting spit on, people getting hit and assaulted, being scared out there. And that, it gets ignored as well, and people are the same reaction that they have to anti-Black racism they have to that. So
I was gonna say again that part and the scope and impact, like, not only is it like a bold statement that the scope and impact is exaggerated, but like, you're presenting these things as though they're quantifiable without quantifying them. So how far are we off? Well, what percentage? What are the values? Like, you didn't prove it when you talked about police violence, because you just compared car accidents and didn't really analyze those numbers at all. You haven't proven it at any stage in this but you're saying that there's a gap between basically what Black people believe or are told and what the reality is, with absolutely no evidence or anything to support that notion.
That's right. That is exactly what's going on here. And it's funny because these are the type of articles that people who claim to be very scientific, claim to be very, I'm always looking at the scientific method and statistics and numbers, and I'm very analytical. And these are the kind of articles that people bring up in the race context to say, see, look, this supports my point of view. And it's very upsetting to see these things that kind of, pantomime, I guess you could say, or just like pretend to be like a scholarly evaluation of this issue of race.
It's like Ben Shapiro intellectual value.
Yeah, just sell your house. If it's underwater, just sell it, right? Like that's Ben Shapiro. It's the same kind of thing. These kinds of holes in your logic will start to appear because your intention is not to really actually delve deeply and critically into an issue. It's just to push a narrative and to help people reinforce conclusions they already have.
So 2006, who was president? 2015, who was president? He's not accounting for the fact that there are actual changes in society,
Right.
You're talking about white people that knew somebody, or Black people that knew white people that were racist. Is that what the thing was?
Yeah.
So like he doesn't look at that and go, oh, Black people knew more white people were racist.
Right.
They were more likely to know a racist white person. It's they believed that the white person was racist. It's not like the actual white people were more or less racist.
Right.
And unless unless your white friend tells you their daughter knew, then you don't get to believe it.
Right. But, exactly.
Yeah, and that goes back to the part where in setting up the article where we basically talked about that it could be three things, and it's probably not the other two. So we've arrived kind of at this place where we're not considering any other factors. We're not considering the environment. We're not considering education. We're not considering, people's day-to-day interaction with other people, the political spectrum. We're not considering any of those things. We narrowed it down to three, and it can't be those two. So it's this one.
Yeah.
And it's absurd.
And he goes on. Gallup notes that 94% of Americans, including 93% of white Americans, now support interracial marriage. Oh, well, that must mean racism is over. Yeah. Respective increases of almost 45% and 55% from 20 years ago. When it comes to race relations, the progressive left is selling non-white Americans a doom and gloom message that is thankfully out of touch with reality. So his bias is showing through there, right? Like, oh, thank goodness this isn't the truth, like what these people believe. Thank goodness we can be rest assured that we live in a better society than what people who are actually living in this exact society I'm talking about are reporting, which is information that I could never have access to without speaking to them. But I've decided.
And what is the doom and gloom reality? What are, like he's talking about people like me, what are we selling other than what he said already is true? Like, we're saying there is a wealth disparity. We're saying there is a judicial system disparity. And that when we look at those disparities, we have to be able to say, look, we need that's a systemic thing, and we can't fix those without fixing the system. And he's like sitting there, I don't know what he's saying. He's just dismissing that out of hand. And we're selling this doom and gloom. It's not doom and gloom, it's just reality.
Right.
They just stop it. But I think about that a lot too, especially when we create this kind of political context for this conversation, that the notion becomes that these liberals, blue-haired ladies, are manipulating other populations in order to gain a larger group toward their purpose. That the entire existence of Black people as political and beings is in service of someone else, and we're like somehow incapable of processing that information and understanding those conditions when they exist. We're just being led by the nose into depression and into who we vote for.
Black people aren't capable of independent agency or,
right.
or your own thoughts. You're just being manipulated by people like me.
Right. Previously in the article, it said that that the liberals are selling that argument, but really this is that argument. This is that we don't have agency, and we're not seeing a clear picture, and we're not aware of the environment that we're in. We're just being led by the nose by people who want to take advantage of us for political reasons.
And in reality, at least in my case, it is not that I'm leading Black people. I'm talking to Black people, learning from Black people, and changing, having my mind changed by that experience. But like, I'm actually learning from Black people what the Black experience is and saying, hey, we need to resolve some of these things. Well, like it's the other way around. It's not me, leading white people, me being led in this direction by Black people by actually having an open mind.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a overgeneral attack, because it's not like some people like that might not exist. There definitely are people like that who just want some sort of consensus that they can move forward with to achieve whatever they're trying to achieve. But to imagine that upon all of the people, the entire Democratic Party, or everyone who leans left, or whatever the thing might be, it's offensive on every level. It entirely dismisses and villainizes all of the left and the Black people who also vote left, and it views those separately, like where Black people are just a tool of this process. And it's more racist than anything they're talking about. Like, you doing this is apparently not the scope and impact.
Right. And it's just so patronizing, right? Like, that, to think that a generations long battle with racism that we've been fighting in this country, that we wouldn't have been able to get enough knowledge about our own existence, our own experience. It's just, it's baffling to me how people who call themselves logical can do it. Like, it's shocking, really. All right, let's go on. But
they're not talking to people like you. They're talking to people like them.
Yeah, true.
To justify that they're right and that they don't need to change anything. Yeah. Which is, again, I just keep going back to that whole thing about white tears. That's what this whole article is. It's just white tears.
Let's lap up some more white tears. So here we are. The virtuous lie about racism also promotes learned helplessness among Black people by suggesting that every element of society is rigged to keep them oppressed, and there's nothing they can do to change that. A study published by the Manhattan Institute asked Black students to first read 2 passages and then to agree or disagree with a variety of statements designed to measure the degree to which they felt in control of their own lives. For example, when I make plans, I am almost certain that I can make them work. The first passage was from Ta-Nehisi Coates' 2015 essay, Letter to My Son. In it, Coates claims that, quote, in America, it is traditional to destroy the Black body. It is heritage. And that, quote, your body can be destroyed if you sell cigarettes without the proper authority, or even turn into a dark stairwell. I would argue sleeping in your car. I would argue walking down the street. I would argue sleeping in your dorm room. I would argue, going to work. Like, all of these things have resulted in Black people's death. Like, the second passage was from Eric Kaufman, who authored the study. It argued that African Americans are the descendants of conquerors, and that they lived in sophisticated city-states and kingdoms like the Ashanti Empire. The study found that Black teens who read the passage from Coates were 7 to 15% more likely to agree with statements indicating helplessness and disempowerment. What in the world?
This is the dumbest study.
So the argument is that because 7 to 15%, because Black teens who read the Coates passage we're 7 to 15% more likely to 7 to 15, by the way, 7 to 15% more likely to agree with statements indicating helplessness and disempowerment, that somehow means that a narrative of virtuous lies is poisoning Black teens' minds and causing them to commit suicide at higher rates. Am I following the logic correctly here?
Yeah.
Trying to suggest that both these things are true, that there are, like if you go back into their African tribal heritage, that they were conquerors, and that should be just as much as a part of the Black American lived experience as like people getting choked to death for selling cigarettes.
Which is, I mean, that would be fine if that was the argument. If the argument was like, hey, we should talk about the holistic history of Black Americans, I'd be like, I'm all for that. I think we should talk about.
But I mean, in terms of their daily, like, is this just like, is it? That would be like me saying that right now we should are like, it'd be like me saying that we're the historical owners of Black people. Which is like when it comes to like when it comes to teaching about slavery, that's bad. It's like the history is not as real as the present, is what I'm saying.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it like, yeah, I agree that we need to do more in terms of teaching, like the rest of the, like even like not just Africa, but also South America, like below the equator history and their culture, but that's not like the same thing to a guy that's, a Black kid in the inner city.
I mean, as somebody who has spoken to a lot of Black kids in the inner city, as I worked in the New York City school system from 2006 until 2011, and then again from 2015 to 2018, like, this article couldn't be more far afield from what these students are thinking and experiencing and dealing with in their lives. I mean, you couldn't find something that's more remote in terms of like its relation to their actual lives. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this, is because somebody must push back on these narratives. Like, we have to have someone actually pushing back on this, what I call a false reality that's being created here. And I want everyone to understand, I did invite the authors of this piece to come. And I invited them because, listen, we need these people to either be called out for what I would basically call borderline evil, which I think this article like basically represents, if this is intentional and they know what they're doing and they're doing it knowingly. But if they're doing it ignorantly, right, even if it's willful ignorance, I'm still going to give people an opportunity to change and to see the error of their ways and to make corrections and to do better. Now you can see that they're not here and they didn't take that opportunity, but I still think that's important. It's just something I wanted to throw in there before I continue.
I'm just going to go out on a limb and guess they're not going to watch this either.
Who knows? I think it's more likely they'd watch this than participate in it, but we'll see.
That's exciting.
Hi. Thanks.
I know. I hope I get an honorable mention. I also wanted to say about those two statements that if they're both true, why are we juxtaposing them?
Exactly.
Why would we not do both? If we believe that there's benefit in saying the one, we don't need to trade it for the other. We need to do both and more.
Thank you. That's what I was trying to say. Yes. Better said than I did.
Well said. Yes. Well said. All right, let's keep going. The virtuous lie that racism is endemic and prevents... He loves saying virtuous lie. The virtuous lie that racism is endemic and prevents Black people from ever getting ahead is unlikely to entirely explain the spike in suicidality among Black teens. So now he's even saying... Is it implied in that statement there? If it doesn't entirely explain it, then aren't you kind of implying that racism probably does play a role in it. Like, that's so weird. Like, it's this weird tightrope rocking that he's doing in this article, but like so poorly. He's fallen off the tightrope so many times now. Nobody's like, we don't care about this anymore. Like, what?
Immediately, because to say that after already whittling it down to just 3 things and having already dismissed the other 2, we're just pretending like this is the one it can be the most. And now we're saying, there's a little bit of doubt. It could be something else.
Okay, but he's going to try to keep justifying it here by saying, but the idea that catastrophizing about racism hurts the mental health of Black teens makes sense. Okay, help me make sense of it. He says, as Al Garby notes, the internalization of these messages may contribute to the observed ideological gaps and psychic distress among women and people of color. In many left circles, great efforts are made to sensitize everyone to historical and ongoing bias and discrimination. Ooh. Women and minorities are told to attribute negative outcomes in their lives to racism or sexism. It's so wild. I'll get back to it in a second, but like, let me read the rest of this quote. They are encouraged to interpret ambiguous encounters or situations uncharitably, i.e., as manifestations of racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. These tendencies likely undermine the well-being of the populations they are supposed to help. What in the world? How? That is so tortured, that argument.
What defines an ambiguous encounter?
He's
like
making an assumption, right? They have to be ambiguous, and it has to be people mind reading, right? It has to be people making assumptions and not like actually using their critical thinking skills and awareness and life experience to actually identify racism that he can't see, right? And that's what it all comes down to. And I've experienced this so much in my actual life. It's so triggering, actually, because in my poem that I wrote, anybody can take a look at it on my YouTube channel, Contraband of Race War. There's a line that says, I was perplexed when my friend of many years came to deny every instance of racism that I decried with, there's always another possible explanation. It doesn't always have to lead back to the plantation. But often it did, so I started staying quiet. Right? And that's what I learned, is that no matter how much you try to explain to people who are not experiencing the same oppression that you're experiencing, no matter how much you try to describe it in minute detail or universal language or in a way, or make a metaphor or make some kind of relation to their own life, they're still going to, their default is set on finding an alternative explanation. It's the number one thing. And I'll give you another explanation, another example. And this is, I do believe it was race-based personally, but we can put that to the side for now. But I was talking to a couple colleagues of mine not too long ago, maybe a few 2 months, 3 months ago. And we were talking about a previous supervisor who I had, who they also had. And they were like, oh, like X, Y, Z, like, they were great, this and that. And I was like, oh, well, I wasn't really treated the way that you guys were treated. These are some of the things that happened to me. And their immediate response was to defend that supervisor. Like, and I was just like, I wasn't even trying to criticize them. I literally just told you what happened to me. Like, and their immediate response was to go on the defensive for someone who wasn't even there. And so it's like, this is like the kind of programming, like they don't even realize they did that, but obviously I could see it. I could perceive it right away. So there's these divides in thought, racism has divided us at the level of thought and life experience. And that is something that a lot of people don't want to acknowledge, because it would mean that you would actually have to gain that knowledge only through communicating with someone who is experiencing that, or by reading someone who wrote down what they experienced, but even that can have its limitations. So I think that the implication of that is worrisome to people, and that's why they create these fantastic narratives and these wild explanations of reality in regards to race.
Yeah. it's also incredibly dismissive. Like, to imagine that I could have experienced something, and not have, and not allowed, be allowed my own interpretation of what happened, like that you externally can hear what I experienced and tell me that it's not what I thought it was. Like the audacity,
Yeah, the audacity, right?
the level of an entitlement that I actually told, that reminded me that I told a story on Twitter where I said that that when I was a teenager, I encountered a lady who told me that she thought I was pretty, that I almost looked like a white girl if it hadn't been for my skin and my nose. And someone immediately came into the comments and was like, that wasn't what here's one of those stories again. Like, I didn't mention the race of that person at all. And you're defending this person who is completely unknown to all of us, based on my description, against this notion of racism. Like, you're coming here to say that person didn't mean it that way. Like, maybe it was a black girl. Like, I didn't even say. It could have been anybody. It was just a lady. And I explicitly made a point of not saying that. And they said it anyway, because that default defensiveness is that I can't possibly know what I experienced. They didn't mean it that way. That other people definitely aren't doing that. And that, I mean, I've come to recognize that as people's own defensiveness of themselves, rather than anything that has anything to do with me or the person, anonymous person in the story. And so I largely stopped explaining myself, like, because I'm not going to argue with you about whether my perception of what I experienced is valid. We're not going to do that.
Right.
I'm capable enough to have known what I experienced, and your defensiveness about it, or your need to protect yourself from the notion that you might have done something similar once upon a time and it could have been misconstrued by someone like me. It's not my business.
Right.
Like, I'm not going to defend my experience to you.
See, this is helpful for people like me. And by people like me, I mean cisgender, straight, white males. Because I don't have that happen to me. Like, nobody ever challenges whether my evaluation of my experience is real. It's just, and as a result, I can just assume that people do. And it's like, it's not that way with everybody.
Exactly.
And so it's like, I have to be conscious of that when you tell that story, that, okay, my reality and your reality are not the same. I'm not, and that is a result of systemic racism. It's a result of systemic misogyny, and with contraband, with systemic homophobia. Like, those are real things that I, as I don't know what else to call it, but a beneficiary of certain biases, have to realize that those give me a kind of confidence, if that's the right word.
I think that's a great word.
And realize that this is also a result of systemic racism, not just biases against you, but biases for me, and that I benefit from things that you don't benefit from. And so it's not like I didn't work hard to get what I got.
Yeah.
But to also recognize you have to work even harder. And I think a lot of times, like straight white people, they feel like, oh, then you're saying I didn't earn this.
Yeah.
And it's not like people are saying that.
Yeah. No.
They're saying that everybody should have the same opportunity to earn their success that you have.
Precisely.
It's not that you should have less, it's that they should have more. I should give you the same benefit of your lived experience as I assume you would give mine.
That's right. So
absolutely.
I feel like I want to go one step further from where we had this conversation about differing experiences, because think about this now, right? So now I'm experiencing a different experience, life experience than you. I'm trying to communicate with you about that, and I get shut down and suppressed. So now I feel like I can't even share it, but I'm still experiencing it. I'm still perceiving it, and you're not perceiving it. And so, and then oftentimes, these people who are not perceiving it are people who are in a position of power over you. So now
Yeah.
you're trying to navigate
Mhm.
this person's lack of perception and your hyper perception, like are going to clash because like how do you deal with that, right? Like you can't really bring it up. You just have to kind of internalize it and take it in and then walk softly and make sure that you're, dodging and weaving. And that is operating from a different, mindset, from a different point of view, right? Then, and another word that I think that describes what you said is you have security, not just confidence, but you have a level of security in your
Mhm.
thoughts, that your thoughts are going to be received, that your thoughts are not going to be rejected, that your experience is not going to be rejected, that it's going to be valued, that it's going to be taken into account, that someone will listen to you. All of these things come into question for racialized Black people in public spaces or in professional spaces. And
Yeah.
you have to be aware of it, because if you don't, it'll come out and snatch you up. Like
Yeah.
things will happen, and if you're caught unawares, then that can even make the situation worse sometimes. So it's a very
Yeah.
difficult self-perpetuating issue.
Yeah, I was going to say that because, yeah, I mean, that it's self-perpetuating, because if I say I had an experience and you say, no, I didn't, and I be quiet, then you feel like that somehow bolstered your perspective on that. So now that I'm not willing to argue about it, or that I've been shut down, and I'm unable to argue about it, somehow validates that no, I didn't actually have that experience.
Right.
I merely imagined it.
So then I go on thinking that I was right and you were wrong, and
Yeah,
which reinforces my experience that you were wrong.
And the whole
exactly.
world will reinforce that conclusion that you came to. So then you have no reason to question it. And
Yes.
then
And then
that's how
I
you
go and
come
write
to
an
like, oh,
article
Black people
about
must be delusional because everyone's reinforcing the conclusion that I came to. And that's how
right.
you
Right.
get, this whole network and narrative
Yeah.
out there.
When you get together with other people and you come back with that experience, you're like, oh yeah, my friend told me about an experience and I said no, they didn't, and they shut up. And yeah, me too, yeah, oh, that's crazy, they know they're lying.
Exactly.
You know, that I say this a lot, that I feel like one of the most important lessons that just we can have as people, period, but specifically in this case, like just the thought I might be wrong is like
Yeah,
one of the most powerful things a human being can have. That's like that is the root of all kindness as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
I mean, we're human beings, right? We're going to be wrong. Not only we might be wrong, but you are wrong about something, like we
Yes.
all
Right.
are.
Oh, for sure.
you know, so like that's part of the human condition, and I try. That's why when I have these conversations, I try to get people to understand, like, if you're wrong about something, I am not going to. I'm not going to try to make you feel bad about that. Like, I'm a teacher. My students are wrong all the time, right? And like, if I was just going around like lording myself over on them, like, like some kind of, evil witch or something, and just like laughing, cackling at their mistakes, like, what kind of teacher would I be? And similarly, if I was having these conversation on race and somebody was ignorantly talking about it, and I kind of used that as like a cudgel against them, what kind of human would I be? And
Yeah.
so it's not about not making mistakes. It's about recognizing that you will make mistakes and being open to acknowledging them and considering them and making changes, and we all have to do that. And it can be difficult for anyone, regardless of your current, status of your thoughts, or, whatever class or race or anything you are.
And having the humility to learn from others, like to learn from your experience, to learn, you know, from Tori's experience. Like I, I one thing but the other side of that is I might be right. You
Right.
know, which on your side, you might be right. Um, so don't shut down.
Yeah.
I kind of like to, and whenever I'm in a meeting, a business meeting, I always like to pretend I'm the second smartest person in the room, but I don't know who the smartest person in the room is.
I like that.
And I believe in myself, but I also believe in everyone else in the room.
I
And I,
love that. That is a very cool statement there. You should like patent that or something or copyright it. That is
But not
great.
sure.
Yeah, that's like
Yeah,
book material. Go ahead.
it feels like a little bit of a detour, but I do want to say that I think that we've kind of backed ourselves into a corner about these discussions, because yeah, people should be able to have humility and be able to face the idea that they're wrong, but we've put racism in the category where it's not just wrong, it's evil. And to be wrong and to have committed some of these, done some of these things that you're hearing about, as stories about racism or people's accounts, and you have to face what you yourself may have done, is it's a difficult proposition, because you're not evil, and you know you're not evil, regardless of how terrible anyone is, they don't believe they're evil. And so
right.
to put those two things really against each other and say, like, you have to maybe come to grips with the way that you've supported or done racism is a really challenging thing, because of the way that we've told people racism is evil. And that's why we've experienced kind of this notion of racism, that it's nothing, like, it is the Klan robes and the N word and nothing else, because
Yeah.
everything else is small stuff, and I do that. So it makes it really difficult. I think that, I believe people need grace, and I can understand, coming from a place of saying that you wouldn't use it as a cudgel, but it already is. To just admit that is to say that some part of evil exists in them, and that's really difficult.
Yeah, as it does in all of us, And so the way that I deal with it personally when I'm in these conversations is I'm not gonna I'm not gonna draw any lines between us. I'm not gonna draw any boundaries between us. We're the same,
Yeah,
like so. If I'm saying it about you, I'm saying it about myself, and you can be rest assured.
yeah,
And so I'll bring up situations where like I said things that were out of line, and I had to like take accountability and responsibility for that, or I did things that I wasn't proud of, and that does give people like makes people feel a little bit better to say, oh, like you're willing to talk on that, like maybe I can do it too. And I use the same techniques in my classroom with my students as well. Like today even a student, I was working with a student. He's a young black man, sitting in the back corner of the room, and I'm back there working with him, and we're working on a problem together. And the fear this kid had about answering a question I asked him about a problem was so palpable, and he like literally was frozen with fear and could not speak. Very much a similar situation to where I have conversations with people who have racist beliefs, right? And I kind of like highlight their belief without directly doing it, and then they're like they kind of come to it on their own, and they're like, oh God, what do I do? And he was in that space, and I just told him, listen, it's okay if you say the wrong thing. Like if you say the wrong thing, what's gonna happen? I'm not gonna like, call you out in front of everyone. I'm not gonna, make you feel like you're a bad person. You're not a bad person. And I told him the same thing I said here, which is we're human beings. We make mistakes, especially when we're learning something new or learning something difficult for us. So making mistakes is part of the learning process, and you have to accept it in order to grow. And he finally answered the question that I asked him. And guess what? His answer was not only right, but very thorough, And I was just like, brother, think about what you just did there. You're your own worst enemy. You stopped yourself out of fear from answering this question that you not only knew, but you knew it through and through. And he's like smiling and laughing after realizing this, right? Because he's realizing, oh man, how silly that was. And I'm like, listen, we're going to get you over that. That's what we're going to work on this semester. And so now he's had that experience to build off of for the future. And that's just the same thing I try to offer with people with these conversations on race. Have the opportunity to have someone not call you a racist, to not like do this and that, but still challenge you. But like, show that like we're no different, and that like if you want, you can change, and if you want to learn, you can learn, and if you don't, that's your choice, and you can do that too. Okay. And nobody's
Yeah.
gonna pressure you or anything.
I think we need to take the stigma out of the word racism.
Yes.
And I think it's in How to Be an Anti-Racist that he says everybody is racist. Or what, not everybody is racist. Everybody has racist thoughts, including him. Ouch.
Mm.
My cat is
It's
wanting
because
out.
we're taking too much time from from pets. But
So but the idea is like everybody has racist thoughts, and we can either accept or reject those thoughts. And to be an anti-racist starts with recognizing that's a racist thought. I don't have to accept that. I can reject that thought. And
yeah,
so like
and there's nothing wrong with that. It happens to we all have thoughts that we have to reject, like, or that we choose to reject. And
yes.
so like, yeah, remembering that you're the master of your own sea, you're steering the ship, and that like you don't have to give in to your monkey brain thoughts that like, give you things, or the things that were programmed into you from a young age. You can recognize them and you can let them go. Okay. And let them pass.
This thing with Charlie Kirk where he said, "Oh, I see a black pilot and I have to wonder if they're qualified." And he's like, "But that's not who I am." And it's like, "But no, that is who you are."
Yeah, because you're accepting that thought. You're accepting that as a valid
thought, and you chose to accept it. So yes, that is who you are, but it's not who you have to be.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You can say, no, he has the same qualifications, the same pilot license as anybody else, and it is just racist it is a racist thought to think that he's not qualified, and I choose to reject that thought. Like, yeah, and that's actually very, very empowering when you start doing that. Like
and it does happen from the other side too. Like, I mean, we have to like, I feel like we have to be holistic about this, right? So like on my end, right, I may think that what someone said is racist, and this has happened, and then I'll investigate. Though this is the difference for me. If something happens where I'm like side-eyeing it, right, I will investigate. I will find out whether what my initial thoughts about it are correct or not. And if I can't find out, guess what? I say I don't know. I will not make a final judgment. I'm perfectly happy sitting in I don't know space. And but oftentimes just with a little bit of investigation and questioning and listening, you'll find out the truth. Anyways, just to say that, it's not like we're all walking around here with no tools and no ability to see what's what. Okay. Like, give Black people their agency that you said, like, we're being denied to like perceive our own reality. How about that? So, all right, I'm going to read the rest of this, guys, and then we'll give our final thoughts and we'll wrap it up. Thank you guys so much for your staying back. Here we go. Heightened perceptions of bias and discrimination are robustly associated with mental anguish. Robustly associated. Interesting. Social strain and adverse physical outcomes. The more people perceive themselves to be surrounded by others who harbor bias or hostility against them, and the more they view their life prospects as hostage to a system that is fundamentally rigged against them, the more likely they become to experience anxiety, depression, psychogenic, and psychosomatic health problems, or to behave in antisocial ways. When we tell Black children and teens that the system is rigged against them, that police have declared open season on them, and that they cannot succeed in life, we should not be surprised when some of them become depressed or even express a desire to end their lives. We should, however, be careful not to understate the effects of racism. Well, too late for that. A Pollyanna-ish attitude can produce its own problems. If we refuse to listen to Black teens when they tell us that they have encountered racism, we may leave them feeling unsupported, ignored, and alienated. They need to be supported appropriately, and they need adults to help them put their encounters with racism into appropriate and non-catastrophizing perspective. We also need to be precise. Sound solutions to pressing societal problems must be based on accurate data and responsible claims. How ironic. Virtuous lies can inhibit our ability to solve those problems. If we want to have a chance of truly improving society, and it can certainly stand to be improved, then we must begin by telling the truth about the current state of things as best we can. The end. I have a hard time believing that's as best he can. I just really don't believe it.
Yeah.
I
Final
always get
thoughts.
a lot of conservatives that talk about that quote Orwell. As that whole last paragraph to me was just a whole lot of doublespeak.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
your piece is literally about the virtuous lie of racism, and then you say we should, however, be careful not to understate the effects of racism. So the people who are telling you they're experiencing racism and they describe those effects, and people who describe them in general are catastrophizing. But we have to be careful not to understate those same effects that people are reporting. So, like, again, how are we? What evidence has been presented here, Tori? To go back to your point, that people are catastrophizing racism. There's literally no evidence of that in this entire piece.
Not a shred. And they undermine the idea that they might have presented some of it by saying that it is indeed a problem and that people should be supported. But really the put their encounters into appropriate and non-catastrophizing perspective really sounds like we need these guys to walk around with us everywhere and tell us the proper perspective to put our experiences in. They got to help all of us.
Yeah, like a pocket racism describer, right? Like
the authors, yeah, to fit neatly in our clothes so we can calm ourselves down and not overdo it.
It's the Neo Tamagotchi. It'll tell you when you're experiencing racism.
And when most importantly.
All right, MPK, final comments, brother?
I think we've done it. I really appreciated listening to both of you. I feel like I learned a lot today. So
thanks, man. I appreciate hearing your thoughts as well and you sharing your experiences. Tori, as always, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for suggesting this and being willing to engage. We went over 2 hours and it definitely doesn't feel like that to me. Like, no. So that's
it feels like my bladder.
What'd you say? What'd you say? I missed it.
I said it only feels like my bladder.
Oh, right, exactly. Like maybe only there. So I'll let you guys relieve yourselves, and thank you so much for your participation. And I'll see you next time. All right.
Bye. Thanks.
All right.
Bye.
Nice to meet you, Tori.
Nice to meet you.